BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers for making 2018 a success.
This isn't officially affecting or impacting my employer, so this is a presentation I gave last year. And what it is a whole bunch of lessons that I've learned over the last 35, 40 years about why we're so insecure and how we're not fixing it. So please, this is from me and not my employer. Wow, humor, I love it. Okay, so I've been doing this for years, okay? So my first hack was actually, some of you have heard this story. Basically it was on a Primos computer, I was playing a game on it, they put their first game on it, I don't like losing, so I modified the Star Trek game, so I ended up with extra dilithium crystals. Yes! And then I started winning, and they kept on wondering why I was winning every time. And then I showed them, and then they made me responsible for security of that machine. So, and that's pretty much how my career went. The first system on the internet, the mainframe, blah, blah, blah. So I have a lot of history doing this and dealing with all the crazy things. And the interesting thing about it, back in the 70s, it was, hey, the computer's having a problem. In the late 80s, right after the DDoS, it was, wow, was there a worm on our network? Is that what's causing problem? Now we actually have people that have a vocabulary to discuss some of these problems. So what this is actually a 2-hour I'm going to go through real quick. So history of security and privacy, measuring organizations, process, people, technology, and beyond. Sorry, you'll have to go to BSides Delaware to see my presentation on how to hack a job and a career. Okay, so have you ever heard of this guy, Willis Ware? Okay, brilliant guy. Because what he did was he has this document from 1967. Anybody born before 1967? You are old, I told you this. Me too. So he did a presentation on security and privacy. He was really forward thinking. And when he said is, look, security privacy we have to deal with at the same time. We'll notice as we're discussing how privacy was removed over time for expedience. And also he dealt with distributed systems. Here's the distributed systems he looked at. By the way, do I have a laser? No laser? I mean, I have a torch for yay, I'm doing well, but I don't have a laser. Okay, so person's watching me. Hi, people at home, I'm moving. So take a look at the user. If you can see this, identification, authorization, and subtle modifications of software. Has that changed? Okay. Let's see, hardware, failure to connect the proper connection. Cross-coupled with other networks. Has that changed? Okay, look at the 3 threats. The maintenance man, the systems programmer, and the operator. Has that changed? It hasn't. And then we have the hardware and the software because there's going to be failures in user identity and access, control. Has that changed? This is a long problem that we have not solved. And one day, one of you, or maybe us together, we're going to end up solving it. But honestly, it's very, very frustrating. I think that's, now I'm too hot again. Let me put that down. If I go any lower, it could be uncomfortable. Here's the interesting part. There was this guy who had heard in New York City about these people doing phreaking, which is hacking phones. And he said, hey, I want to do this movie. He went to a bunch of people, including the Department of Defense and other people, and asked around. Guess who he found 17 years later? Our friend Willis Ware. So he discussed all these issues. All of these issues, which by the way, you could map each of those issues into issues within war games. Okay? So they put out this wonderful movie. Well, this was during the administration of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, during the START talks, said, hey, can we stop the conversation right now with his generals and admirals and stuff in the room? And he said, I watched this movie, and he started telling the story of the movie. And he said, get back to me within 6 months and tell us if we are potentially compromisable. Well, actually, yes, that's why this was created. Pretty scary, huh? So, there we go. So, over time, they wanted to formalize it. Here's the formalization of how to secure the networks based on that movie. The ideas that actually had to take place, the thought processes to address all of that. Okay. By the way, have you guys ever seen one of those? I have a couple copies of the whole suite at home. It's interesting from an archival standpoint to see that, again, we're still dealing with exactly the same problems then as we are now. Except now we have these very expensive products that only solve 25 or small percentage of this stuff. Okay, so when we started creating these, we realized that we needed to remove privacy because it was too complex to add to the thought process. So we ended up with these different certification accreditation models. In each of those models, we had related to INFOSEC, ComSec, IAS, and misuse of information, personnel administration systems. Does this look like, has anybody done any assessments? Does this look like assessments? NIST 800 series? Yeah, that's actually a more mature version of this. So these are all the interrelated disciplines that we've tried to address, again, the same problems from back here. So what's happened is all the groups across the top have been contributing to creating these standards, great stuff, great documentation, and adding documentation along the way. These are all documents that are available either historic or current in the public space. All different types of guidance. From the certification and accreditation standpoint, they're trying to identify the risks from that first page, from that graphic. What are the safeguards? How do we stop the attacker coming in? How do I modify information denial and unauthorized use? Right? This is what we deal with every day on an offense, or an offense is this is what we're abusing and this is what we're dealing with. For risk management, because risk management came from pretty much the insurance side, how do I see the same thing happen again and again and figure out what the risk is? One of the big challenges of this risk assessment model is people that are doing it may not actually understand what the risk is. Little story, I was doing an assessment for a government organization, and I was told that this server in this room did not need an assessment because it was in the room and nobody could get to it. And I said, really? So let's talk about what some of the problems are. And he described it and described it. He says, but it's in this locked room and you have to sign in and everything. And then I pointed to the computer cable. I said, so what's going through here? Isn't that like an entrance? Do you have access to this? And he just was very angry with me, and it took about 2 weeks for me to come back and actually finish this assessment. But honestly, people have expectations that if a cable goes through the wall, or I have have wireless access that nobody can intercept it anyway, which by the way goes back to that first slide. Okay, this is the current process that we've dealt with, again, for NIST and everything else, for CNAs. Privacy really isn't included with it. Yes, we've added some PII issues, but we haven't talked about the real long-term issues. And by the way, has anybody ever lost their data? Okay, well here's a good question. Have you ever lost your fingerprint data? Okay? Are you a threat now because you can't use this for two-factor authentication? Have you lost any jobs that you know of because you can't do that?
Hopefully not.
We don't know at this point. How about your face? How about your genetic material? That becomes a whole nother issue. If somebody has your genetic material, maybe your kids or whatever, your family, whatever, could they lose a job just because that genetic material has been lost and somebody's going to use it for insurance or advertising or whatever they use it for? Okay? Again, we've been focused on security but not actually dealing with it. And by the way, the interesting part about why this is a problem is if I take something, there's something lost over here. And the law deals with that. The law doesn't deal with duplicating this, and then using it for other uses. And it's really, really frustrating for me because, well, you know, people have my face out there and at resolutions that they shouldn't and things like that. Let's see. So, one of the challenges of the early days is everybody had their own assessment model, every single organization. And by the way, I didn't include all the lack of commercial space, assessments, and audits. It took them a while to actually get in front of that. Here's all the certifications between 98 and 2001. Each one, if you were in the business at that time, and you were just looking at controls, your organization, depending on your organization, may have to go through 5 different audits or 8 different audits and assessments and capability models from different organizations. But nobody had a way of actually thinking about how to pull them together. Okay, and by the way, some of you are still going through this. FISCAM versus a FISMA assessment. Different thing. Oh yeah, by the way, people are certified too. That's what our certificates are. That's what red teams can be certified, CSSPs, you know, whatever the certification process is. By the way, there are now more certifications. And finally, I was picking on somebody at a conference 8 years ago, and I said, look, please, if you're going to make a certification, use the letter Z and Q so I can say that I have the certifications from A to Z. Well, yes, we now have certifications that are Q and Z. So one of the interesting processes that we're actually going back to rethinking was the process of a maturity model. Has anybody heard about the maturity model for threat intelligence? This is to deal with some companies don't have the infrastructure, the people, the processes, the management support, or the legal support to be able to provide a more mature organization, to be able to even deal with threat intelligence. Right now, threat intelligence for those communities are turn it off, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off. Not, hey, is there somebody using this in my infrastructure and can I see if that's actually communicating with a command and control, and can I understand which systems were actually compromised by that? Oh yes, or you're not even using the threat intelligence, you're just getting it and paying for it. Which, when I've done some assessments and talked to customers over the years, there are a lot of them that don't even, they're paying for a service they're not actually using, especially to the fullest. So here are the categories from 1 to 5. 0 is basically not even performed. How many organizations have you seen don't even perform this? Okay, how about on voting machines? Do they perform on voting machines? No, seriously. How about automobiles up until recently? Okay, so we have performed information, so essentially it's a base. The big challenge about this, performed this way, is whoever's working for that has to be a superhero or a unicorn, because this is why people need unicorns, because it requires so much work, it requires so much knowledge that usually after you've done it a couple times you've burned out. Then you have plan and tracked, well-defined, quantitative analysis. This is where threat intelligence becomes real important. A lot of the high-end products become important, connecting your infrastructure. And quantitative improvements. This is where we actually want to get. We want to basically see that something happened in our network and we can actually change it via a smart person within a few minutes, or some machine learning stuff because I got bored of seeing it happen all the time and I make it change automatically. Okay, this is where we are. Again, we left this because this was a hard process for people in the 90s and early 2000s. Let's see. There we go. And if you want these slides, I'll send them out. And sorry, they're so small. The room was only supposed to have like 60 people in it when I presented this, so I made sure the screen was the right size and the resolution and everything else. So if you look at the red, this is the most level of waste, the level 1. Again, the heroic effort on the design. How many people did early cloud stuff? Okay, you were doing heroic work just to figure out how to secure it. And did you get all the information you needed to secure it adequately? No, most of us don't when we get into a new technology. Okay, and then basic project management. Does somebody actually have a project management? Are they actually creating metrics around it? Again, when you're, especially in the cloud, I mean, how did you actually have a metrics around how many people logged in, how often they logged in, do they log in at night, and they logged in a day? None of that existed in the early days of cloud, even up to, let's see, 2008, 2009, when I was implementing cloud for some people. Processes. Are there validated processes? Oh, for the cloud, one interesting question. Are you allowed to actually connect into your cloud provider's processes as feedback? Anybody able to do that right now? How about DNS enumeration of your networks? Because they're using DNS and not scanning your networks. Can you get access to that stuff? Or DDoS? Again, these are processes. As you mature, you'll get a lot more information, and then towards the top is pretty much productivity and quality. This is where we want to become. Secure and insecure. By the way, that took some time. Wait a second. Here you go. Bam! Yeah, that was my fancy stuff. So, has anybody heard of system security engineering? Okay, NIST put out a wonderful document. This whole concept was killed in the late 80s, early 90s. Why? We had devices that had blinky lights on them, and because they blinked, they must be secure. And we ended up buying more of those blinky lights. We've now come to the conclusion that the blinky lights haven't protected us very well. This is the processes that were recommended originally. The NIST team under Dr. Ron Ross has done a wonderful job expanding this and bringing this to the future. Now here's the issue. How many of your organizations have a system security engineer during projects? All those hands, holy shnikes. There, by the way, for the people at home, maybe you were raising your hand, but nobody here was. So, if you can see the blue, the green, and the reddish pink thing, the hardest thing for most organizations to get security going is dealing with the organizational process and teaching the project managers. Because honestly, when it comes down to the engineers to figure out how to do monitoring and things like that, we've got it nailed. The real maturity comes in working through towards the right-hand side of this process. Okay, and again, this is another matrix. I have a link to this. So, to simplify this whole process, NSA came up with this thing called the IAM, IEM, and what they did was they said, hey, why don't we create a process to, number one, identify how to do an assessment, and it dealt with all the process stuff. You know, are you doing a backup? How do you know you're doing a backup? Okay, can you retrieve one file for me? Oops, your backup software is not working. Oh, there's a log here that says it hasn't been working for a year. Awesome. Okay? Again, we don't do that very often. The second one is the evaluation, where we're scanning, we're doing some lightweight penetration testing. Third is actually a red team. Love red teams. So this was the process. By the way, this was defunded and it's gone. Some of the documentation's still floating around. There's some software, but it was meant as a formalization of the process to strengthen the organization's processes, people, technology, and policies, so that you could actually have a mature infrastructure. Currently, I'm not seeing a lot of processes from the auditing community, from the assessment community to be able to do this besides the compliance stuff. This was the planned time, and by the way, you'll see this in, this was late 90s. You'll see a lot of these ideas included with most of your auditors' assessments and pen testers' processes. So this is a very sound process to go through. Let's see, like as an example, I like what the NSA was doing here with this workshop. What they did was they asked a really interesting question. They would get a group of people together, and they would different experiences within the organization, and they would ask a question. They said, what is the most important products you have, the data, in the organization? And you'd write it up on the board. And then you'd score it based on how many people thought it was the most important. And at the same time, the people in the corner, the security people, and the auditors would sit quietly, and then they would come back and actually discuss what the criticality of most of these things were. Do you know what usually the lowest priority of most organizations were? Email, because nobody needs email, right? Because nobody saves things. Oh, by the way, the reason I wasn't able to get access, because I can't access my email to get this light. So, okay, in my case, I failed, okay. But that was usually the lowest from a priority standpoint. So if you want to look this up, there's some information about here. What they then ended up doing is say, what is a system? What is a system at this point? It's not just a computer, it's a bunch of data that's being processed. Does anybody look at the system end to end? Who's the consumer and who's the producer? Especially long chains of these systems, the supply chain of data. A lot of people don't look at that. I was looking at one assessment at a time and found out that they had a really good supply chain except for one thing. They couldn't afford certificates. So the supply chain in and out the organization was all via email, non-encrypted. Okay, this included PII information, this included pretty much everything, healthcare information. It was pretty amazing. You can't find those unless you actually do an end-to-end from a consumer process. Okay, so one of the things they did was, after you got the assessment completed and you defined what the categories are, you would then say, well, those systems were part of these organizations. You would then classify medium, high, low, things like this to identify them. And that was the process you did. Prior to doing the physical assessment, you did this risk assessment. By the way, this process works for all of these systems, not just a bank, not just a federal agency. This particular INFOSEC methodology can work with pretty much any infrastructure, which is pretty cool. So then they have the activity, they go through the process. Let's see, I'm going to go quick. This is okay. They had the IEM, which was a hands-on. The nice thing about the IEM, for those that have never run an assessment, go learn about it. It talks about why you're doing different things, how to do a scan, what type of scan, what you're looking for, things like that. Let's see, vet the process. Yeah. One of the other things that we found to be successful is vet the process with the customer. You know, what are you doing? This is wacky. Make sure you have legal and scope. You know, nothing worse than starting the assessment against a cloud infrastructure that part of that cloud's owned by somebody else. Very inconvenient. Okay, create rules of engagement. Create scoping questions. By the way, if you're starting up an assessment, this is the perfect scoping questions to ask. Okay, you do an in-brief. A lot of organizations gave up the in-brief process, which is, here's what we're here to do. Can you bring all the important people in, or the most important person in that's the supporter of making this happen is funding it? And oh, by the way, put the people in the same room that we're going to be working with so we can meet them, and you can say, hey, these are the people we're working with and this is why we're doing it. A lot of organizations will do assessments without doing that, and then you don't get the right information and there's usually pushback. It makes it real hard. And then post-assessment, which is actually creating a list of things. This hasn't changed in years. This is exactly the same assessment stuff we do every time. Except a lot of organizations don't like network sniffing. What do we learn from network sniffing? Bad configurations and routing. Routing people are never wrong. Okay? I love routing people. I'm a routing person, yes. The other thing we find out is protocols that aren't encrypting things. Okay, so that's something that becomes real useful. There are tools in the market. There are some bro configurations that will do this for you, and Snort and Sercata, but these are things you definitely want to look at. And password compliance, how many people are using two-factor today? Here, a little trick on two-factor. You can buy these little USB things. They're relatively cheap, and you can actually use them at home. What a concept. Okay, this one just happens to be a YubiKey because I got a stack of them from a conference, but consider taking a look at it. Technical. So when we actually have risk, do we ever see assessments from a risk standpoint mapping it back to what we found? This is the crown jewels. Here's what we found. And by the way, it was not only the crown rules, but the data coming in and the data coming out. The authentication, things like that. Here's what we can use. Again, NIST is recommending something similar to this. Others have in this process. Let's see, COPS. You then map all this to say, you know, how secure are the criminal records, like in this case, criminal records, warrants, blah, blah, blah. By the way, this is just an analogy from somebody else. This is this particular set of slides about a criminal organization is not mine. And then going down and saying, here's all the CVEs that are actually matched to this particular thing. We have things like Nessus that will do parts of these. But sometimes, unless you map it correctly, you don't actually say that this vulnerability actually impacts these three systems. So this vulnerability is the one we want to get rid of in all these three systems. Here was the coolest thing from the IEM. Once you actually found the risk, and you took the vulnerabilities, you created a table with the highest up on the upper left-hand corner and the lowest and lower right-hand corner. And that gave you the ability to work with the customer and say, everything in red, you need to finish quickly. Everything in yellow, you want to take care of. The things in green, if there's three of these together, they become yellow or potentially red. Deal with this. This way it allowed people to actually go through this process. There's a finished high-level risk of one system, and it becomes lower towards the right. By the way, customers understand this. They don't understand a lot of the current deliverables that we're giving, sadly. Oh my God, I got through this quickly, sorry. So again, going back to, let me go all the way back. Okay, going back to this. Still haven't solved it. We now know it's there. We have a process that we may end up testing to see if it exists every year. We really need to go to infrastructure on a real-time basis, that we're seeing risks to our important things happen. From a defense standpoint, also, I'm sorry, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing again and again, expecting different results. I think it's time for us to stop the insanity. Oh, see, wasn't that perfect? To stop the insanity and start thinking differently. Is there a method that's out there that succeeds? Oh, by the way, if you were to learn the method that succeeded for you for 8 or 9 years, and you were a bank or you're a federal agency that didn't want to actually be compromised, would you turn around and publish it?
Hell no.
There are organizations that have never been hacked based on some of those technologies. And no, most of the time it's not just the blinky light things. So start asking people, so what is your, especially when you're in conferences like this, so how well have you done on securing this or securing that? Or if you're red teams, any red team people in the, they all ran away, that's awesome. If you have red team people, you'll get 3 types of red team people, which are, I mean, they're all brilliant in their special ways. Sorry, that actually sounded pretty bad. Sorry, those at home. They have experience on actually how to hack systems. And a lot of times what you get is you get people that can go in and get the target and you're done, 4 hours and you're done and have a nice day, write the report. Okay? You have people that take a little bit while, and then you have places when you do assessments, you don't get in. They've stopped everything. So they turn around, they come back and say, hey, we don't just want you to test this, we want you to test this much now. And they can't get in. Then they say, you know, go this far. And they don't get in. Those are the people we need to figure out where they are so we can learn some tricks from them. Oh, and by the way, for pen testers, the hardest thing we have is to go and do a pen test last year and find out that they fixed nothing over the year. If you look at a lot of the commercial organizations, that's what we hear all the time. Hey, wow, they never got funded for this year, but next year they're going to get funded to fix these problems. And what do you think most of the fix of the problems are? Not good engineering, but blinky lights. So it gets really, really frustrating doing this. And yes, I've been a pen tester and I succeeded, and there was a few times I didn't succeed and went, yes, somebody actually figured it out. So that was pretty cool. Any questions? Sorry, this was the last minute. I usually do a lot more preparation and rant and everything else, and she's trying to follow me. You notice she has to get up every once in a while, which is really fun. So if I run around the room, will you? Just kidding. Any questions? Again, sorry, this was a last minute type ranty thing. Oh, and by the way, here's a good question. How many are testing the IoT devices in their organizations? How about the heating system that's in the building that has a computer attached to it? They call them boilers. They go boom if things happen. How many people have checked their important, I don't know, transportation device products? Those are becoming critical. Oh, by the way, I got a new car, and you know what the first thing it did when I pulled into the garage? It tried to access my Wi-Fi. No. Okay. Think about that for your organizations. Are your people connecting their cars and their other technology to your critical networks? Okay. So things are changing. Oh, and by the way, very soon we're going to have devices for extra memory. We already have heart implants that have Bluetooth. We already have cochlear implants that have Bluetooth. Are they accessing your networks? We're not looking at those kind of things today. We're also not looking at different frequencies that there are now tools that are in the open source that are used by hams, that are used by the biological community, the physics community. There's lots of other things that we need to be looking at to figure out, are we protecting ourselves? So, any questions? Woo, I ranted and nobody ran away. Not too many people. So, thank you.